Welcome back to App Stories. Today's show is brought to you by Notion. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Viticci. Hi, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing really well because I'm excited about the Vision Pro, but we're not going to talk about that today, Ticci. No. We are going to talk about the DMA, the EU's law that is going into effect in early March, that we got big news about a week ago, as we record this at least, where Apple has done a bunch of things to try to comply with the EU's new regulations. And they don't know if they've complied because the way this whole system works is it's like the EU passed the law. It's vague, which I'll get to in a minute. And Apple has to kind of say, here's what we did to comply with your law. And then people can object. And then there'll be at some point a ruling as to whether Apple actually did what they were supposed to under the law. So it's not like there's a law that says you have to have a menu of 12 options of browsers when someone's opened Safari in the EU. That's Apple interpreting what the DMA says. So we'll get into all that in a little bit, but it's been quite a ride trying to understand this. This is like incredibly complex. It's spread across developer documentation, press releases. You and I each had two different calls, one together, one separate, where we got briefings from Apple about this and learned about what was going on, and we had an opportunity to ask a lot of questions, which was good because, obviously it's very clear that Apple's been working on this for a very long time, and it's involved a whole lot of people within the company that obviously know it very well because they've been intimately involved with it. And here we were coming in, totally cold, trying to figure out both this incredibly complex law as well as what Apple was doing to try to comply with it.
Yeah. And it's been such a challenge to understand the complexities and sort of make sense of the confusion that was created by this announcement, by this proposal, which will go into effect on March 6th or 7th, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll have to see if there will be any sort of counter proposals to what Apple is offering here. But yeah, it's been very confusing and very difficult to parse, especially the business terms, which we can get to in a minute. But sort of like, what would be your best way to summarize what Apple is actually doing here?
So, first of all, I will make one disclaimer here.
Yes.
Which is, while I used to be a lawyer, I was a corporate bankruptcy lawyer in the United States of America.
Okay.
I am not an expert on EU law. And
well, did you know there are so many of them on Mastodon?
I was going to say, there are so many experts in EU law. And what's funny about it too is that, like, I would venture to say that if you go to any country in the European Union right now, there are no more than a handful of people who are, quote, experts at the DMA, because the DMA, even though it is EU law, it's a brand new EU law. Like, not even lawyers in the EU are really necessarily expert at the DMA.
They should ask the people on Mastodon then.
Right. Other than I'm sure that there are plenty of lawyers in the EU, in EU countries, who have studied it carefully because they have clients there. But I do want to say that because people act like they know what they're talking about. And I don't want to get into the law a lot here because I'm not qualified to do it. Now, the differences between me and, say, you on this is that I was at least trained to be a lawyer. So I can look at a law, even if it's not one from the United States, and I can read it. And from my experience, which was like 25 years of doing that, I can give you a pretty good idea of how companies will react to it and try to comply with it or not comply with it, for that matter, and give you a sense for what I think about it. But I have no idea what the European Commission's thinking about with this any more than anybody else on Mastodon. So that's my disclaimer. Okay. That's my disclaimer.
Okay, sure.
But I do also want to think about, I think you need to think about this law and what Apple is doing differently than the way we normally think about Apple. And it's hard because when we got that press, we're used to Apple puts out a big press release. Everybody gets excited. They look and they see. And you do this with the DMA press release that came out. And you're like, oh, there's all these new features that are coming to iOS. And the natural inclination, I think, is to treat that like a product announcement. because these are features, or they're features of the OS. It's a little bit like, 17.3 just came out. What's in it? And that is not what this press release was. Yes, there are new features in operating systems, but this is like a legal compliance press release. This is the plain English explanation of what Apple is doing to deal with the DMA. And that is where there's like this cognitive dissonance with it, because you read through this and you think, oh, there's going to be alternative browser engines in iOS. And then you realize, why is it not on the iPad? Because it just doesn't make sense that that you could have multiple browser engines on iOS but not iPad OS. Why wouldn't you do that if you're Apple? Well, they're not doing it, not because they're not doing it because they don't think having an alternate browser with an alternate browser engine is a good idea. They think it's a bad idea, in fact. And so, like, when I come at this, looking at it, I think first you have to take at face value that Apple sincerely believes that what the DMA is forcing it to do is a bad idea.
Okay.
That it's not worth the risk. This is a, cost benefit analysis thing.
Yeah.
And when you look at it, what they have said and what they've told us is that they believe that this leaves iOS worse for users in terms of privacy and security. Now, you don't have to agree with that, but that is where they're coming from. And I do think they sincerely believe that. So you have to look at it, though, from that point of view, too, not just the point of view of developers who want a more open system or users who want a product that's easy to use. So, it's like there's like this three pieces, this puzzle that we have to kind of consider how they fit together. It's like, why is Apple acting the way they are? Why are developers upset or happy? I don't think any of them are particularly happy. And what's going on with users? And I think, unfortunately, the users are getting the shortest end of the stick in this whole thing. I mean, I don't think they're coming out very, very well from this. But doing that, I think you realize that Apple, when you look at the changes, you can see reflected in them the shape of the DMA. And I think that's where, maybe we shouldn't get too into the weeds in terms of what exactly is changing, just because a lot of other people have done that. And I think, for instance, Mike Hurley and Jason Snell did a very nice job with that with Upgrade this past week. Mm-hmm. But there are two concepts that the DMA seems to be trying to do. They've got the concept of gatekeeper, which is essentially a big tech company with an important platform that the digital economies of the world rely on. So you have the concept of that, and Apple's not the only one of those. Google, Amazon, others fall into that category too. And then there are these core platform technologies, which is very amorphous, and that's part of the problem, I think, to a degree here with this law, that where certain things that Apple does are considered core platform technologies. That's the App Store, because you can't get apps anywhere else. That's Safari, because that's the default web browser. And it's iOS. And that's why it's like, when you look at what the changes are, they fall into one of those three categories, and they don't spread any further than that. You're not going to see, other than a couple of small things that Apple is doing worldwide or doing across platforms, the core of the compliance with the DMA is focused on those three things, and you're not going to find those things coming to the iPad or the Mac, for instance.
Right. So that explains why these changes are only on iOS. It was the iOS platform that was deemed a what's the terminology? Like a core
platform technology.
Okay, core platform technology. So that's iOS. And thankfully Apple split iOS and, the iPhone and iPad years ago, because otherwise, if the iPad was still running iOS, that would have been included here. But technically, Apple doesn't have to include iPadOS because it's a separate platform. The EU only considered iOS, right. Where the law would be applicable. And therefore, Apple says, well, we are forced to do this by the law in the EU for iOS, but because we think it's such a bad deal for users, we're just going to do it where we are required to do so, and no more than that.
Right. And one of the things that I think is interesting about this, like I was on Clockwise last week, and Dan Morin asked the question, do you think the DMA is meaningful or a poison pill? And the poison pill concept is something that Mike and Jason talked about on Upgrade, which is the notion that the deal terms and the business deal terms, which is where I think a lot of people are upset with those more than anything else, that those are designed to make it so unattractive for people to take this new deal in the EU that they just won't, and they'll just stay with the old App Store. And my answer to that question was it's both, because it is meaningful to me that we have the European Union has passed a law that has caused Apple to create over 600 new APIs to comply with it. You might not like how that's been handled by Apple, but the fact of the matter is that those technologies have now been built into iOS, and the genie's out of the bottle. Other countries around the world, whether it's the United States, or Canada or Japan or wherever, can look at what the EU has done and say, we want some of that too. We want our developers in our country to be able to use these APIs so that our users have these additional choices as well.
It creates a precedent for other countries.
Yeah, exactly. And this is by no means finished, because as I said at the outset, the EU hasn't said that what Apple is doing is okay. And I kind of expect that they will say it's not okay, that they'll say you got to make some changes. But they have made changes. And I honestly was very surprised at the degree to which Apple went, the lengths that they went to comply with the DMA. I really thought it was going to be more like the Epic Games reaction, where it's like, okay, we'll take off 3% off of your commission, and you can go use your alternate payments and whatnot. I thought it was going to be a very minimal reaction. And what we got were, over 600 APIs. So there's that aspect of it. And then there's the poison pill aspect of it, which I think captures another angle of this that I think is important to keep in mind, that I don't think that this reaction by Apple is designed to capture the kinds of apps that you and I use and write about. That this is more to deal with Spotify and Meta and Google and all the game makers of all the freemium games, because I think that, especially when we get to the core technology fee, which is a fundamental shift in the way that the App Store works when it comes to free apps, that is designed to keep freemium game revenue flowing into the App Store. Because the way those games work, and that's where most of the money is being made on the App Store. That's been reported over and over again over the years, that somebody downloads a game, then they end up buying gems or whatever it happens to be to play Candy Crush or whatever the game is. Right. And Apple doesn't want those games to leave the App Store. So what they're doing is they're creating this core technology fee that you have to pay, even if you have a free app, as long as you have more than 1 million annual installs, first annual installs. This is like a very convoluted definition.
Yes, it is.
Which we can go into if you want.
Yeah. Well, is there an easy way to get into it? Like what?
I think I can boil it down.
Okay.
A little bit, which is the way it works is a first annual install is the first time someone puts an app on their device, whether it's a first installation, an update, a re-download, it's any of those things. But it's only counted the first time that happens in a 12-month period.
Okay, so the first time in 12 months. And then on after 12 months and 1 day, if you download it again or update it, it's going to count again.
Right. So, for instance, if WhatsApp decided they wanted these new EU rules, and you downloaded WhatsApp tomorrow.
Right.
In 366 days from then, you could get updates. You could take it off your phone. You could put it back on. None of that would count against these statistics. It wouldn't count again until you did something a year after that. And the first million of those installs is free, which means it's not until you get to 1,000,001. And when you get to 1,000,001, the developers charged 50 cents per install, per annual install. You follow me?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm following.
All right. And now I think that Apple says that will affect less than 1% of the developers out there.
Mm-hmm.
And they also say that 99% of developers will pay less or the same that they currently pay. I have no transparency into that. I didn't do the math. They did. They haven't shown us their worksheets, so we don't know if that's true or not. I mean, I would venture that it is true, but who knows? And that leaves people open to something that I think really bothers them, is the idea of, I have a free app that I've released. It goes viral, and all of a sudden I owe money that I can't pay because I'm not making any money on this app. But maybe I have 2 million downloads, and all of a sudden, and I'm owing tens of thousands of euros to the EU. I mean, not to the EU, to Apple.
To Apple, yeah.
In the EU, to Apple. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Notion. There's no shortage of helpful AI tools out there, but using them means switching back and forth between yet another digital tool. So instead of simplifying your work, it becomes more complicated. Unless, of course, you use Notion. I love Notion because there's so many different ways to use it. You can use it for your personal work or your work life. You can store a list of books you want to read, movies you want to watch, or you can do what we do at Mac Stories and do things like organize a huge development project, assigning tasks, viewing timelines, keeping documentation for the project, all sorts of things. I discovered Notion right at the beginning when it was first launched, and have been around for a long time because it's such a simple and easy to use service. You can find it on the web or use the apps on your Mac, iPhone, or iPad. Plus, it's cross-platform. And as I said, we've been using it for all sorts of things: podcast show notes, development tasks, and other projects. It's perfect for all those things because it's so flexible and versatile. Notion combines your notes, docs, and projects into one space that's simple and beautifully designed. You can save time and write faster by letting Notion AI handle the first draft, jumpstart a brainstorm, or turn your messy notes into something polished. You can even automate tedious tasks like summarizing meeting notes or finding next steps. Notion AI does all of this and more, and frees you up to do the deep work. And the fully integrated Notion AI helps you work faster, write better, and think bigger, doing tasks that normally take you hours in just seconds. Notion is used by over half the Fortune 500 companies, and teams that use Notion send less email, cancel more meetings, and save time searching for their work, and reduce spending on tools, which helps keep everyone on the same page. Try Notion for free when you go to notion.com/appstories. That's all lowercase letters, notion.com/appstories, to try the powerful, easy-to-use Notion AI today. And when you use our link, you'll be supporting our show. Again, that URL, it's notion.com/appstories. Our thanks to Notion for their support of the show. I mean, I think what the thing about this fee is that it really is a fundamental shift, because when you go back to I'll go back to even before the App Store existed. Before we had an iPhone, Apple had a developer program, and it cost hundreds of dollars to be a developer. And it cost hundreds of dollars to get VHS recordings of the WWDC videos. It was expensive. It was not like something that a kid in high school could go to their parents and say, Mom and Dad, I'd like to learn how to make an app. And they couldn't do that unless their parents were willing to cough up lots of money. With the iPhone, that all changed. We went to $100 a year, and apps could be offered for sale or for download for free if somebody wanted to. And that really, really jump-started the App Store. I mean, I think it's hard to overemphasize the benefits of having free apps on the App Store very early on, because it got a lot of people excited. It made it lowered the barriers to entry to becoming a developer, and it really got the App Store going very quickly. Now it's a little different. Apple's saying, kind of like they could have said back in 2008, they could have said, it's going to cost you $100 to be a developer, and if you do free apps, we're going to charge you, I don't know, 50 cents per install because we're hosting your files and you're using our technologies, you're using our APIs, all that stuff. But they didn't do that. But now they kind of are. They're basically saying, here's the fee that's for the use of our technology, which are the APIs. I mean, I suppose developers are free to try to build their apps without Apple's APIs, which would be very difficult. And you have to pay it if your app becomes popular enough that you reach this, you cross this million install threshold. And I think that I think people feel that in a really visceral way, that is not the deal that existed with the App Store since the beginning, and it really bothers them. And I'm not surprised that that's the case. And I'm not really judging it one way or the other. It's just the way it is with the App Store, I guess.
It's complicated.
It is very complicated.
And thank you for the technical explanation so far. Is there more that you think you should explain to our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things we could talk about. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about who lives in the EU and who doesn't. I think that's super interesting to me.
That is, we spoke about this on this week's episode of Connected, where basically there's going to be this system in iOS 17.4 based on this technology called Country D, which basically assigns an identifiable region, an ID for your region that's kind of independent from the region setting or your Apple ID. In fact, it combines multiple factors, including the region setting that you have on your phone, the billing address of your Apple ID, and other factors like location, to make a decision regarding where you are and if you should be considered by iOS a European user. To give you a practical example, I have an Italian iPhone. I'm using iOS set to the United States regional setting, and I'm using my famous sort of fake US Apple ID with a US billing address.
Yep.
And still, if I go to the latest iOS 17.4 beta, to General About, and scroll to the bottom, and you see the new identifiable region sort of option, still the system determined my region is Italy. So
right. I would add that you even have a US payment method.
Yes, US payment method, but obviously the system realized, well, this is a person who lives in Italy, doesn't leave Italy very often, has a US Apple ID for some reason, has the phone set to US region settings, but this customer is in Italy. And therefore, I bet I will be in I have no idea what's going to happen, because I'm using the American App Store from Italy and have been for years.
Right.
But what happens when my identifiable region is Italy? Am I going to see, to give you a practical example, am I going to see alternative payment methods in the American App Store because my identifiable region is Italy?
Did you see the browser?
I did not. So this is an interesting question. A bunch of users have seen the new default browser picker, which is a new feature that we showed off on Mac Stories, where the first time you open Safari in iOS 17.4, you will be prompted to, if you want to choose an alternative browser. I did not see this screen when I first opened Safari in 17.4. But again, my region, the system determined it's Italy. So there, I bet I will be part of some weird edge case in which I don't know what's going to happen, but either the App Store is going to be broken for me and I will not be able to access features like alternative payment methods. Like, I don't think I will be able to pay with my American Express card from Italy if, say, Spotify decides in Europe to adopt alternative payment methods. But I cannot make a definitive assessment of that because, again, when I go into settings, the system decided you're a European user.
Yeah,
so
and I think that there are going to be other edge cases, people who live and work across borders that are, one country's in the EU and the other isn't. And that's not that uncommon. I mean, Switzerland's sitting there right in the middle of a bunch of other EU countries, and there's Northern Ireland versus the Republic of Ireland. And then, of course, there are all the people who are living along the edges of the rest of the European Union. So there are a lot of people in those situations, I'm sure, that might get caught up in something. It's hard to know exactly how that's going to work out. Apple says that they've thought about that, and they've obviously thought about it, at least to the degree to figure out that you live in Italy. What I do know is that a couple of things, I guess. One is I asked about what happens if you live in the EU, but then you move away. At some point, you will lose access to your third-party alternative app marketplaces and any updates to the apps that you had purchased from that app store.
Mm-hmm.
So you will lose. There is the possibility of doing that if you leave, a country that has these special rules. So there's that. On the Safari stuff, one thing that's kind of interesting, I did hear from one of the browser makers about this. There are 12 different options that are randomly shown in random order to EU users, and it's based on, I was told, popularity of those browsers. And so it's different per country. But some of the apps, I was told, at least by this browser manufacturer, these are not all, they didn't consider them all browsers, because there are some weird ones like AI search apps.
U.com. First time I heard of it. U.com.
Yeah, there are a bunch on the list that I publish on Mac Stories that I'd never heard of. And I mean, I've heard of a lot of browsers, but I had not heard of all of these browsers. And it's not like a weird local to a particular country app, I don't think. But anyway, there's that. The couple other things we should probably talk about before we wrap this up.
Yeah.
One is getting back to why I think this is a poison pill to a degree that's designed to keep the big players in the App Store, which is the way the fee structure is. I mean, it's a poison pill for the big players, but it's, when it comes to the other fees, it's a poison pill for the littler players, the indie developers, because the way the fee structure is that there's only going to be a couple of % difference for a smaller developer between what they get what they have to pay under the small business program and what they would pay if they adopted the EU rules, which I should have also mentioned is a one-way thing. Once you adopt these EU rules, you cannot go back to the old rules under the existing App Store. You can stay and still use the existing rules under the App Store if you want, but once you leave, you can't go back. And once you leave, you can still distribute under the App Store as well. It's just that you're still under these new rules, which, I think a lot of people are unhappy about that as well, that you can't go back. Yeah, we had some hypotheticals posed to us about how difficult it would be to unwind that. It does sound like it would be very difficult to do. I don't know if it's impossible or not. I haven't thought through it carefully enough in all the scenarios, but Apple has decided that it would be too difficult, especially from a user standpoint, which I think is also a topic worth briefly mentioning, because we know a lot of developers. We've talked about a lot of this in the context of what it means to developers, but this has an impact on the people who live in the EU. I think it's going to be a big nothing burger for them for the most part. I don't think most people are going to care that much. That, they've got their apps, they go to the App Store, they mostly download free stuff anyway, and they're not going to be faced with a lot of alternative app stores, I don't think, in their daily lives. I mean, I may be wrong, but I kind of think that if, all things being equal, it'll be a little confusing, because I know I had one person tell me that it's incredibly user hostile to throw up this choice about browsers. And it's like, well, maybe, but it's also required by the law. So what, that's one that like Apple can't really do anything about that. And it's basically what's done under Android already. So, I mean, I don't think that that's going to change, but it is, it does raise like a good example, I think, of how this is going to be more complicated for users. I think it's also going to be more complicated for developers. Another criticism I think too is that it's like, well, Apple's just making it really difficult to adopt the new e rules because they want everybody just to go for the easy route, which is stay in the App Store. And it's like, well, yeah, maybe, except that also the App Store is like this integrated system that inherent to the system itself is going to be easier. Like it's like you and I saying we're going to stop using Memberful for Club Mac stories, and instead we're going to have a separate agreement with Stripe to do payment processing, and we're going to use this other system to create the content, and we're going to roll our own system for tracking who's a member and who's not, and we're going to put up a site for the payment. And it's like anytime you go ad hoc like that, it is going to be more complicated. I don't think the DMA doesn't require that it be as easy as an integrated system. It just requires that people have alternatives. And I just feel like inherently an integrated system like the App Store is going to be easier no matter what Apple does. So we should round it out. Last thing about what do we expect to see in terms of alternative app stores?
Marketplaces, right?
Yeah, alternative marketplace. I should call them that because App Store is like an Apple thing, but alternative marketplaces.
I think it's very likely that what we're gonna see is, I think we'll definitely see something like an actual alternative app store or marketplace where we will get a variety of developers making apps that maybe they have only released for Android so far. But basically, I'm thinking of things that Apple would regulate because of copyright issues or just content issues that they cannot regulate in alternative marketplaces. So I'm thinking of stuff like emulators, for example. And in fact, I believe the Alt Store developers are already working on refactoring Alt Store, which is this sort of an alternative app store that's more similar to TestFlight than anything, that involves that doesn't require you to jailbreak your device. It's based on a sort of strange technique that basically tricks the system into thinking you are a developer who are and you are sort of self-signing these apps with your developer certificate. They're gonna switch over to Marketplace Kit, which is the new framework for alternative marketplaces. And so that idea of, well, we actually have an alternative marketplace where we can get a variety of software, things like clipboard managers that maybe don't run with the same limitations that we have on the vanilla App Store. But that's the big maybe, because I believe that even though you may not be regulated because of content issues, so for example, things like emulators, the Google Play Store is full of emulators. One of the greatest things about Android is that you can open the Play Store and download Dolphin, download Yuzu, Citra, download all these emulators from the Play Store. So I think game emulators, console emulators will definitely find their way to iOS in Europe because of marketplaces. But I don't think those apps will be able to use private APIs still, because they will be scanned by Apple still. And I believe there will be safeguards in place to prevent those developers from saying, like, for example, I want to make a clipboard manager that runs in the background and does some weird tricks to always monitor the system clipboard. I don't think, based on how Apple described the alternative marketplaces, I don't think that kind of utility will fly. I think Apple will still block it.
Right. And that's the thing about notarization, right? This is not like unfettered sideloading of any
Yeah.
random software that you want. It's still going to be checked. It's got two levels of checks. One is an automated check, which is very similar to what's already being done with notarization on the Mac, and generally how iOS apps are automatically checked when they're submitted, which is they look for things like the use of private APIs already, and that's how, some people get their apps rejected from the App Store. And then there's going to be a limited human check too, as it was described to us basically as to make sure it does what it says it does on the tin essentially not like as careful a check as app review, but a quick check to see if it does that it's not like some sort of obvious scam app.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that we'll have those kind of apps for sure. I think we'll have those kind of stores. There'll probably be things like gambling and Bitcoin. You got to think of it from a content standpoint, adult content. It's things that can use existing APIs, but Apple doesn't allow them because they've made the decision that they don't want those kinds of apps on their app store. Those are the kind of things that you can expect to see. And you can go to the review guidelines and you can see what is prohibited from being on the App Store from a content standpoint. And that is probably a pretty good list of what you could expect to see on these alternative marketplaces.
Yeah. I think we're definitely going to see the big arrival of Chromium browsers on iOS in Europe.
Yeah.
I think from Chrome to maybe even Arc, the Arc browser with a new version, Vivaldi, like all these browsers based on Chromium, which is the alternative engine to WebKit. I think that's coming. Chromium is coming on iOS in Europe. And Google had a version of Chromium, of Google Chrome running on Chromium for iOS done months ago. They've been working on this stuff. And so I would be really surprised if Google doesn't take that opportunity to launch a real version of Google Chrome on iOS. Now, sure, that will lead, however, to a particular case of fragmentation, right? For users, not necessarily for Google, the company. Google doesn't care, right? Google is just going to say, well, we have Chromium on desktop. It's the most popular browser in the world. We're also going to have Chromium on iOS in Europe, because why not? And that allows us to control more sort of the experience when using Chrome, and to tailor what people see on Google search results, for example, because we fully control the rendering engine, we fully control everything. We have the same ecosystem of extensions, and people are in Europe can use, if they want to. You can bet that you will open Google.com in Europe, and you will see a giant pop-up to say, hey, you want to get the brand new version of Chrome, that like the real version of Chrome or something? Like, that's going to happen.
Sure.
But so Google is going to be happy, but for users, it's going to be fragmented, because people in the US will have the quote-unquote fake Google Chrome based on WebKit, which is just a reskin of Safari, whereas people in Europe will have real Google Chrome on iOS. So there's going to be fragmentation for users and fragmentation for platforms, because again, it's only iOS, it's not iPadOS.
Yeah, no, and I think that's an important point, because we are moving into a world where this is not unlike what's happening with the internet to a degree, where we're seeing more and more regulation of the internet itself. It's not just, for instance, China walling itself off from the rest of the world on the internet. We're going to have a fragmentation of iOS itself, which is interesting because, I can imagine now I'm not going to be able to cover that Chromium browser that Google puts out. There's no way for me to actually do it physically. Now, we have obviously you and Nilian in the EU, but what happens when we have a brand new version of iOS in Japan, for instance? I mean, it's going to be this fragmentation where people in different parts of the world are going to have different experiences, and that causes practical coverage problems for us. But I think it's also not necessarily a good thing from a user standpoint either.
Yeah.
All right, Federico, I am going to close out by saying to all the developers that I really feel your angst on this whole thing. I really am sympathetic to developers. I know a lot of developers. My kids are developers. I tried to be a developer and decided that it was a better route to become a person in online media, which says a lot about how hard it is to make a living as a developer because media was more attractive. And I think this is the first inning of a long baseball game that we're going to be watching and seeing what happens. I don't expect the EU will be satisfied with Apple's response. I think it'll have to be revised. And I don't know. I mean, it's going to be hard for a lot of people. I think it's going to be hard for developers. It's going to be hard for users. It's going to be frustrating for us as well for various reasons. But it'll also be interesting. And I think it does open up some opportunities that weren't there before, even if it's maybe not as broad-based and deep as a lot of people would have hoped. All right. I want to thank our sponsor again for this episode. That was Notion. You can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. We're on Mastodon. Just go to viticci.macstories.net or johnvorhees.macstories.net. And we're on Threads and Instagram. Federico is at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHEES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.